Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. We begin with story 1, the night the Thames stood still. It was a December unlike any other, though at the time, no one could have predicted its quiet significance. London, bustling with merchants, sailors, and tradesmen, found itself caught in the grip of a winter so severe that the Thames, the very artery of the city, stopped flowing in the usual way. Frozen not entirely solid, but enough to halt small craft, the river became a temporary landmass, a strange and eerie stage on which everyday life shifted in unexpected ways. You might imagine the Thames as a constant, moving silently beneath bridges and wharves, carrying goods, news, and rumors from one side of the city to the other. On this particular night, however, that constant became a stillness. Ice formed slowly but steadily, a surface that reflected torchlight and moonlight with a crystalline shimmer. The boats that usually creaked against the water's pull were immobilized, moored in frozen midstream. The river that had once connected communities now separated them, forcing citizens to reimagine their routes, their routines, and even their understanding of time. Life in London in this era was already governed by rhythm. Merchants opened their stalls at first light, and their orders depended on the tides. Fishermen knew the river's moods as intimately as the wind patterns. With the Thames incapacitated, the daily choreography of commerce and survival stumbled. People crossed by walking over the ice in carefully measured steps, feeling each crack and creak beneath their boots. It was a fragile experiment in trust, the ice carrying the weight of lives and livelihoods alike. For the ordinary Londoner, the frozen Thames was both a curiosity and a danger. Children found endless amusement in the strange terrain, gliding awkwardly on makeshift skates, laughing at their own precariousness. Adults, however, measured the ice with a more sober mind. Traders fretted over the goods stranded on their barges. Bread supplies threatened to dwindle if transport could not resume. There was a palpable tension between wonder and anxiety, and this tension stretched across the city, coloring each conversation, each cautious step on the frozen river. Yet, amid these immediate concerns, a subtle shift occurred, one unnoticed at the time but profound in hindsight. The pause in the Thames forced a convergence of individuals from disparate social classes. Nobles and merchants, dock workers and apprentices, all shared the same precarious surface. Conversations that might never have happened were sparked simply by circumstance. A merchant might offer advice to a sailor about testing the ice's thickness. A child's cry over a slipped foot could elicit aid from a passing noble. This collision of worlds, facilitated by the river's unusual stasis, created a temporary social cohesion that defied the usual hierarchy of London society. Meanwhile, local authorities, unsure of how to react, oscillated between panic and resignation. Patrols were dispatched to prevent accidents, though the sheer scale of the frozen expanse made enforcement nearly impossible. Orders were given to ration food, to keep fires burning longer, and to ensure that water could be drawn from alternative sources should wells freeze. Each measure, practical and dull on the surface, became critical to survival. Historians rarely dwell on these mundane responses, yet it is precisely this careful administration of the everyday that allowed life to continue, relatively unbroken, during the extraordinary pause. As night fell, the city grew quieter than usual. The usual hum of river traffic, the clatter of carts, the shouts of dockworkers, all were replaced by an almost sacred silence. Only the occasional crack of ice reminded citizens of the delicate balance beneath their feet. Families huddled indoors, warming themselves by fires while listening to the faint echo of distant footsteps on the frozen Thames. The stillness encouraged reflection, a slowing of thought that mirrored the city itself. In that quiet, you can almost sense the subtle shift in the collective consciousness of London, a recognition of fragility, of dependence on forces far beyond immediate control, and of the unexpected ways ordinary life can be interrupted. Yet, for all its apparent calm, danger lingered. Ice, no matter how solid it seems, is capricious. A misstep could plunge a man into frigid water, and any rescue would be laborious and uncertain. The ice also strained under the weight of accumulated snow, threatening sudden collapse in pockets across the river. Citizens had to navigate these risks while maintaining their daily routines, turning the mundane act of crossing a frozen river into a complex exercise in survival and observation. Historians often overlook this event not because it was insignificant, but because its significance lies in the slow, almost imperceptible ways it influenced society. Trade adjustments, social interactions, administrative practices all were altered, and many of these changes persisted long after the ice melted. For instance, merchants began to keep small stockpiles closer to home. Sailors developed new methods for estimating ice strength, and social networks expanded, forged in shared experience across a temporary frozen expanse. As dawn approached, the first faint warmth of the sun touched the ice. It began to shimmer differently, a subtle change that hinted at an imminent thaw. People paused, looking at the river, aware that the temporary world created by winter's grip was soon to vanish. Boats would float again, commerce would resume, and the city would regain its usual rhythm. Yet the memory of that night lingered, a quiet awareness that even the most stable systems could pause, that time itself could slow in unexpected ways, and that ordinary lives were more intertwined than they often appeared. And as you, the observer, imagine walking along that frozen Thames, hearing the soft crunch of boots on ice, feeling the collective tension of a city paused mid-river, you might wonder, how did this single slow evening, unremarkable in many accounts, ripple through the lives of Londoners in ways they would never fully recognize? What small adjustments and human interactions from that night shaped the city's future in ways that historians seldom bother to mention? By the morning after the Thames froze, the city of London had begun to adjust to the strange rhythm imposed by winter's grip. Where once boats and barges had carried goods with predictable regularity, now pedestrians, sledges, and horses had to navigate over the uneven ice. Merchants realized that the flow of trade, a system they had taken for granted, was suspended, and they scrambled to find alternative routes. Small wharves, normally bustling with activity, became gathering points where people shared news, advice, and complaints. It was in these interactions that the subtle social shifts of the frozen night began to manifest. The market districts closest to the river were among the first to feel the pressure. Bakers, butchers, and grocers faced the challenge of moving their products without the aid of barges. Wheat, flour, and salted fish, essentials of daily life, were delayed, and prices began to fluctuate quietly but noticeably. Citizens, already accustomed to daily scarcity, adapted by stretching supplies, swapping goods informally, and forming temporary cooperative arrangements. Historians often overlook these mundane adjustments, yet they reveal the resilience and ingenuity of ordinary people. Without formal decrees or announcements, the frozen Thames prompted new systems of resource management that would quietly persist even after the river thawed. Meanwhile, life continued along the streets. The city's upper classes, largely insulated from direct hardship, observed the icebound river with curiosity and mild concern. Some ventured out to witness the spectacle, traveling in carriages or on horseback over frozen bridges. Others sent servants or laborers to procure essentials, inadvertently relying on the very networks of cooperation that were forming among common citizens. In this way, the ice temporarily leveled social distinctions. Everyone had to negotiate the new reality, and even those with privilege could not completely escape its influence. The practical difficulties of the frozen Thames extended beyond trade. Firewood, water, and fuel, all basic necessities, required new strategies. Water, typically drawn from wells or directly from the river, became harder to obtain. Households had to ration it carefully, melting snow when possible or relying on neighbors for supply. Fires burned longer than usual, consuming more fuel, while kitchens strained to keep families fed with limited ingredients. These small, often tedious adaptations illustrate the hidden labor that underpins survival during extraordinary conditions. The city did not collapse, but it shifted into a slower, more deliberate mode, one that historians rarely document because it lacks the drama of battles or royal decrees. Public safety also became a pressing concern. Although Londoners were accustomed to hazards, the crowded streets, unpredictable weather, and the omnipresent threat of fire, the frozen river introduced new risks. Children and adolescents, delighting in the novelty of skating and sliding, sometimes ventured too far, requiring intervention from neighbors or watchmen. Pregnant women and the elderly faced treacherous crossings to visit markets or friends. Authorities dispatched patrols to monitor the river, but their presence was limited by sheer scale and manpower. What emerged, therefore, was a form of collective vigilance. Citizens watched out for one another, offering assistance or advice, forming temporary alliances based purely on circumstance. These small acts of care and observation, invisible in official records, left lasting impressions on those who experienced them. In the following days, the frozen Thames began to influence the rhythms of work. Workshops, normally dependent on the arrival of raw materials via river, had to pause production or improvise. Carpenters who relied on timber from upriver sources delayed orders. Blacksmiths adapted by sourcing local supplies. Even professions that seemed unrelated to the river, scribes, teachers, and apothecaries, felt the consequences, as the ripple effect slowed communication and delivery. The city, in effect, was recalibrating its internal clock, forced by environmental circumstance to slow its habitual pace. Amid these practical challenges, the frozen river sparked quiet reflection. People observed patterns in the ice, noting how currents shaped its formation, how cracks spread unpredictably, and how different surfaces bore weight differently. For some, this was purely scientific curiosity. For others, it became a matter of survival. Sailors who had relied on intuition and experience now had to rethink the principles of their trade. Merchants learned to measure not only goods, but the reliability of pathways and the durability of ice. In this way, the event catalyzed subtle shifts in knowledge, local expertise, and adaptive strategy, all of which historians rarely emphasize, but which influenced city life long after the ice melted. Socially, the frozen Thames fostered interactions that might never have occurred otherwise. People met neighbors from distant districts, formed temporary partnerships to transport goods safely, and shared stories or meals while waiting for obstacles to clear. In essence, the ice created a temporary communal space, an unplanned public square in the middle of the river. It was a quiet reminder that environmental disruptions, even minor ones, can bring people together in unforeseen ways, nurturing relationships that leave invisible traces on the social fabric. Yet, for all its temporary unity and lessons, the frozen Thames carried an undercurrent of anxiety. Weather forecasts were rudimentary at best, and citizens could not predict whether the ice would hold, crack, or melt suddenly. Each morning's thaw revealed new risks: partially submerged boats, hidden weak spots in the ice, and the ever-present danger of frostbite or hypothermia. These uncertainties forced a level of attentiveness that contrasted sharply with the habitual rhythm of city life. Londoners were reminded, in the slowest and quietest ways, of their vulnerability and the delicate balance between human systems and natural forces. As the week wore on, subtle long-term effects began to emerge. Merchants incorporated new contingency plans, keeping small reserves near markets. Sailors devised methods to test ice strength systematically. Families adjusted routines for water collection and firewood management. And citizens, across all social strata, carried with them a newfound awareness. Even in the bustling heart of London, life could pause without warning, and ordinary events could carry extraordinary lessons if one paid attention. These lessons, small and often overlooked, would quietly inform decision-making, social norms, and the collective memory of the city. By the time the Thames began its slow return to liquid flow, Life started to resume its normal rhythm, but something subtle had changed. The pause had been temporary, yet its consequences were persistent, a reminder that the slow and seemingly boring details of daily survival often shape history in ways that dramatic events cannot. The frozen river was not recorded in great tomes or celebrated in grand paintings, yet its impact was deeply felt by those who lived through it. And now, as the ice finally yields to the gentle warmth of the sun, and the boats creak back into motion, you might ask, what long-term social, economic, or psychological effects did this week of frozen stillness leave on Londoners? How did these quiet, incremental adaptations prepare the city for future crises that historians rarely connect to such ordinary yet pivotal moments? The thaw came gradually, almost imperceptibly, as if the river itself were testing the city's patience. In the early mornings, thin rivulets of water began to seep across the frozen surface, trickling around the edges of stranded barges. The ice, once a solid expanse, cracked into irregular sheets, creating both opportunity and peril. Citizens who had grown accustomed to walking across the river now had to navigate the treacherous transition from frozen terrain back to flowing water. For many, this shift was the most dangerous moment. The ice might support their weight one step and collapse the next, plunging an unwary pedestrian into icy currents. Boats creaked and groaned as they settled back into the water, masts swaying in the gentle current, ropes stretched taut, and rudders grinding against the riverbed. Sailors and traders returned to their accustomed routines with a mixture of relief and cautious respect for the power of natural forces. Goods were transported once more, merchants reopened their stalls, and the pulse of London life resumed, but never exactly as it had been. The city had endured a week of disruption, and subtle adjustments had been ingrained into daily habits. One of the most enduring changes was in commerce. Merchants, realizing the fragility of relying solely on river transport, developed contingency strategies. Some stored essential goods near city centers, while others diversified the sources of their supplies. Informal trade networks, built during the frozen days out of necessity, became regular practices. This quiet restructuring of economic behavior would influence not only the logistics of the city, but also the resilience of its markets for decades. Historians rarely dwell on these minor shifts, yet they quietly shaped London's economic endurance in a way that dramatic events seldom could. Social life, too, had been transformed in subtle but meaningful ways. Ordinary citizens, who had been forced to cross paths on the frozen river, maintained connections that might otherwise have never formed. A carpenter who had helped a merchant pull a sled across a sheet of ice might later receive a small favor in return. Children who had shared skating spaces with neighbors from distant districts carried memories of solidarity and play that bridged social divides. Even the upper classes, who had initially approached the ice with curiosity or amusement, were drawn into these interactions through observation or minor acts of assistance. In essence, the river had temporarily dissolved social boundaries, leaving behind a faint but enduring imprint on the communal consciousness. The authorities, for their part, learned valuable lessons about urban management and emergency response. Patrols, rationing, and water distribution strategies had been imperfect but necessary. Officials noted weaknesses in coordination, communication, and infrastructure, prompting slow reforms that improved preparedness for future winters or unexpected disruptions. It is tempting to overlook such mundane administrative adjustments, but they reflect the often unnoticed scaffolding upon which historical resilience is built. The frozen Thames, in its quiet and tedious way, forced the city to experiment with governance under constraint. Even the physical environment bore traces of the week-long freeze. Riverbanks were littered with small debris, overturned sleds, and discarded goods, a quiet testament to human activity constrained by nature. Boats had shifted on their moorings, and some required extensive repair before returning to service. Residents remembered the ice's stubbornness, its ability to halt motion and command attention, not through violence but through patient, unrelenting stillness. These material reminders persisted longer than memories of particular conversations or minor incidents, reinforcing the subtle influence of the frozen Thames. Perhaps the most intriguing legacy of this event lies in human perception. Londoners had experienced a pause, a week when the rhythm of their lives slowed, compelling them to focus on details they might otherwise ignore. The thickness of ice, the strength of sled ropes, the availability of water, the kindness of neighbors. These observations, small and often tedious, reinforced skills of attention, planning, and patience. They fostered adaptive behaviors that, though invisible in official chronicles, were critical for navigating both ordinary life and future crises. In this way, the frozen Thames served as a quiet teacher, imparting lessons in resilience, collaboration, and careful observation. As the last fragments of ice melted, the river returned to its usual flowing state, carrying boats, goods, and people along familiar routes. Life resumed its outwardly familiar rhythm, but beneath that routine lingered subtle, permanent changes. Citizens had learned to navigate disruption, to anticipate the unexpected, and to cooperate across social and occupational divides. What might have seemed like a minor and unremarkable event, a frozen river, a week of inconvenience had, in fact, shaped the collective habits and consciousness of London in enduring ways. And so, as you reflect on this frozen pause, you might wonder, how often does history hinge not on battles, proclamations, or revolutions, but on slow, ordinary evenings that force people to adapt, observe, and connect? How many other quiet disruptions, forgotten, overlooked, or deemed boring, have silently sculpted the course of cities, societies, and human resilience? The Thames thawed, but the lessons of that week endured, invisible yet potent, shaping the rhythm of life for generations to come. Story 2. The Forgotten Siege of Belgrade's Barns. Belgrade in the early 18th century was more than a city of stone walls and bustling markets. It was a nexus of empires, cultures, and conflicts. History books often focus on the grand battles, the mighty armies, and the sweeping sieges that changed borders. But in the quieter corners of the city, life often moved to its own slower rhythm, where ordinary struggles carried consequences just as real, if less dramatic. One such event, nearly erased from memory, is what historians have later referred to as the Forgotten Siege of Belgrade's Barns. Unlike sieges that capture the imagination with cannon fire and heroic charges, this siege was slow, tedious, and almost invisible. It was the winter of 1717, during a period when tensions between the Habsburg Empire and the Ottoman forces had reached a boiling point. Soldiers marched, tents were pitched, and small skirmishes flared at the outskirts. But the main focus of the siege, what truly tested the city's endurance, was neither the walls nor the guns. It was the barns. The storehouses of Belgrade, holding grain, hay, and essential supplies, became the unintended center of a struggle that would quietly shape the lives of the people inside the city. The barns themselves were unremarkable structures, timber-framed buildings, sturdy yet vulnerable to the elements, filled with the city's lifeblood for the coming months. For the citizens, these barns represented security. Grain for bread, fodder for horses, and dried vegetables for sustenance, all of it was stockpiled in these quiet spaces. When word arrived that enemy forces were approaching, city officials had ordered the barns reinforced and guarded. Yet their defenses were modest. A handful of militia, armed with muskets and improvised weapons, patrolled the barns, while farmers and laborers moved supplies under the watchful eyes of anxious overseers. Life inside this siege was slow, repetitive, and tense. Hours were spent stacking sacks of grain in precise order, inspecting timbers for signs of weakness, and rationing fodder to keep horses alive. Each day brought minor crises: a torn sack of wheat, a broken lock on a storage shed, a sudden snowstorm that threatened to collapse a roof. To the outsider, these details seemed trivial, almost boring. But for those living it, every small problem carried weight, because the survival of families, livestock, and the city itself depended on careful management of these resources. Outside the barns, the conflict progressed with a slow, almost imperceptible rhythm. Cavalry skirmishes were infrequent and minor, more a distraction than a threat. Yet the psychological toll on the city was significant. Residents had to balance vigilance with routine tasks, tending gardens, gathering firewood, and maintaining homes. Fear was never absent, but it was steady, a dull hum rather than a spike of panic. People learned to exist within uncertainty, adapting their habits to the rhythm imposed by the siege's peculiar focus. Children played in small, enclosed courtyards, often under the watch of older siblings or neighbors. They moved hay bales or chased each other between buildings, finding moments of levity amidst the tension. Adults, meanwhile, worked quietly in shifts, careful not to exhaust themselves while ensuring that no barn fell into disrepair. Every act of stacking grain, patching a roof, or checking fences became an exercise in survival and patience. It was the kind of history that is easily overlooked, mundane, tedious, and repetitive, but it was the foundation upon which the city's endurance rested. The siege also illuminated the resilience and ingenuity of ordinary people. Citizens repurposed old tools, reinforced structures with scavenged timber, and devised methods for rationing supplies that minimized waste. Local craftsmen, often forgotten in grand narratives, played crucial roles. Carpenters repaired doors and beams, blacksmiths fashioned locks and latches, and weavers produced sacks to replace damaged ones. Every minor skill was magnified in importance. Without the meticulous attention of these individuals, the barns would not have withstood the strain of the siege, and the city might have faltered long before any cannonballs or musket shots could reach its walls. Food became both a necessity and a tool of control. City officials carefully monitored grain consumption, noting which households had access to supplies and which needed additional rations. They tracked how much fodder horses required and how much wheat could be spared for future baking. These calculations, slow and methodical, were the lifeblood of the siege's quiet management. Outside, observers often imagined sieges as dramatic struggles of force, but in Belgrade, victory and survival depended as much on arithmetic, observation, and patience as on muskets or cannons. Even the environment played a role. Winter winds swept across the plains surrounding Belgrade, chilling exposed soldiers and city guards. Snow accumulated in corners of the barns, threatening to soak the grain if not cleared promptly. Rain could turn streets into mud-choked avenues, slowing supply lines. The mundane interactions between humans and nature, carefully observed and managed, dictated whether life continued smoothly or descended into scarcity. It was a history of small interventions, quiet diligence and persistent observation, boring, perhaps, but crucial. As days turned into weeks, the siege revealed an unexpected pattern. Enemy forces, frustrated by the city's ability to maintain its stores and withstand minor assaults, began to focus elsewhere, leaving the barns relatively untouched. Inadvertently, the slow, careful attention paid to these structures and the steady work of ordinary citizens had turned the city's most mundane spaces into points of resilience. The siege of the barns became a kind of test, not of martial skill or grand strategy, but of endurance, adaptability, and the quiet determination of people committed to preserving life amidst uncertainty. By the end of this first phase of the siege, the citizens of Belgrade had learned valuable lessons about vigilance, resource management, and the hidden power of routine. They had confronted small disasters, collapsed roofs, spoiled grain, sudden weather changes with calm diligence. They had discovered that survival often depended less on heroic gestures than on the slow, consistent application of knowledge, skill, and patience. These lessons, though invisible to the larger narratives of military history, were deeply ingrained in the lives of the people who endured them. And now, as you imagine yourself standing in a dimly lit barn, the air filled with the scent of hay and grain, listening to the distant footsteps of guards, and the muffled sounds of snow against the timber, you might wonder, how did these slow, almost invisible struggles shape the city's long-term resilience? How much of Belgrade's future strength was quietly forged in the repetitive, unnoticed work of ordinary citizens, rather than in cannon fire or battlefield glory? As the siege dragged into its second week, the city of Belgrade settled into a rhythm that was part routine, part anxiety. Unlike the dramatic assaults recorded in military chronicles, this stage of the siege was defined by patience, observation, and the quiet exertion of human resilience. The barns, now firmly established as the silent center of the city's survival, were the focal point of both strategy and tension. Guards rotated in shifts, families assisted in moving supplies, and local officials meticulously logged inventories, all while a cold winter wind swept across the city, indifferent to the slow human drama unfolding within its walls. The daily routine had become a careful choreography. At dawn, guards inspected doors and locks, checking for signs of tampering or weakness. Farmers and laborers moved hay and grain, reinforcing stacks and clearing snow from the roofs to prevent collapse. Children ran errands, fetching water or carrying small bundles of fodder, learning practical lessons about caution and responsibility. Every action, no matter how small, contributed to the collective endurance of the city. In this way, survival was less about singular acts of heroism and more about the cumulative effect of countless ordinary deeds. Outside the barns, the Ottoman forces prowled along the outskirts of the city, probing defenses, but largely leaving the barns untouched. Their attention was directed at fortifications and gates, the traditional points of conquest. Yet this very neglect allowed the citizens of Belgrade to fortify the barns quietly, to adapt and reinforce structures, and to establish supply chains that could withstand a prolonged siege. The enemy's oversight inadvertently amplified the importance of mundane labor and meticulous care, showing how slow, consistent work can shape outcomes just as profoundly as any battle tactic. Food management became increasingly critical. Grain rations were carefully measured, and bakers had to calculate daily allocations to ensure that stores would last through uncertain weeks. Horses required precise amounts of hay, and their well-being was essential not only for mobility but also for morale. People discovered that small inefficiencies, leaving doors open too long, spilling feed, or mishandling sacks could ripple outward, threatening the delicate balance of survival. Each day demanded vigilance and the quiet application of problem-solving skills. Despite the monotony, moments of ingenuity emerged. Carpenters reinforced beams using scraps of wood salvaged from damaged carts. Blacksmiths improvised locks and tools from broken weapons and scrap metal. Residents devised pulley systems to move heavy sacks more efficiently, reducing labor fatigue and preventing accidents. These innovations were modest, yet they demonstrate how necessity catalyzes creativity in slow, painstaking ways. They were not the kinds of achievements recorded in histories of great victories, yet they were vital to the endurance of the city. The siege also highlighted the human capacity for cooperation under pressure. Families, neighbors, and even strangers coordinated their activities to maximize efficiency. Shared meals, communal heating fires, and cooperative labor fostered a sense of interdependence. In a world where cannon fire and formal battles commanded attention, it was these small, repeated acts of collaboration that ultimately determined whether the city could withstand external pressures. The invisible networks of trust and mutual aid quietly became as important as any walls or weapons. As time passed, the weather added another layer of complexity. Snowstorms buried paths and entrances, and sudden thaws created mud that made hauling supplies treacherous. Residents learned to anticipate these fluctuations, observing subtle changes in the sky, the temperature, and the condition of the barns themselves. Each adjustment required careful judgment, planning, and cooperation. The siege was not merely a test of strength, but a slow exercise in observation and adaptation, revealing the often overlooked intelligence of everyday survival. Inside the barns, social hierarchies temporarily shifted. Skilled laborers, carpenters, blacksmiths, and experienced farmers gained influence because their knowledge directly affected the city's ability to endure. Nobles and officials, while still responsible for strategic oversight, depended on these individuals for practical solutions to pressing problems. In this way, the siege blurred social distinctions, creating a temporary meritocracy where expertise and diligence mattered more than birth or title. Such shifts were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet they reshaped interactions and fostered a quiet reevaluation of communal value. Psychological endurance was as important as physical labor. Citizens learned to cope with boredom, monotony, and uncertainty. The slow passage of days, punctuated only by minor crises and routine inspections, tested patience and mental resilience. Children were taught to occupy themselves safely, adults to manage stress and fatigue, and leaders to maintain calm authority without overexertion. In this way, the siege functioned as both a practical and psychological training ground, strengthening the community in ways that historians often overlook. Yet despite the careful planning, uncertainties persisted. Could the barns withstand another heavy snow? Would the enemy discover a hidden weakness and exploit it? Were supplies truly sufficient if the siege dragged on longer than anticipated? These questions loomed over every decision, emphasizing the fragility and contingency inherent in survival. It was in grappling with these uncertainties, in attending to countless minute details, that the people of Belgrade demonstrated resilience, a quiet heroism rooted not in glory but in perseverance. As days merged into weeks, the siege revealed its hidden lesson. Survival in a prolonged crisis depended less on dramatic action and more on careful attention, planning, and cooperation. The slow, deliberate management of barns, supplies, and labor, though invisible in official records, became the linchpin of the city's endurance. And yet, as the situation remained unresolved, one question persisted, quietly gnawing at the minds of citizens and officials alike. Would their painstaking efforts be enough to withstand the siege in its entirety, or would some unforeseen weakness undo weeks of careful labor? The final phase of the siege arrived not with a dramatic storm of cannon fire or a decisive charge across the city walls, but with a gradual realization. The barns had held. Weeks of careful labor, constant vigilance, and slow, deliberate problem-solving had preserved the city's lifeblood: grain, fodder, and essential supplies despite the constant pressure of potential attack. For the ordinary citizens of Belgrade, survival was a quiet triumph, almost invisible in the broader sweep of military history, yet deeply consequential in the lives of those who endured it. By the time the enemy forces withdrew, frustrated by the lack of progress, the city had learned profound lessons about resilience. The barns had become a testament to human patience and ingenuity. Each roof repaired, each sack stacked carefully, each ration calculated had contributed to a collective achievement far greater than any individual could claim. While generals and diplomats might claim victory or negotiate treaties, it was the citizens' steady, repetitive efforts that had ensured the continuation of life itself. The aftermath of the siege revealed subtler forms of impact. Families and communities that had cooperated closely during the crisis maintained stronger social bonds long afterward. Laborers who had been entrusted with important tasks gained recognition and influence, establishing networks of trust and reciprocity that shaped future civic projects. Local officials, impressed by the efficiency and dedication of their ordinary citizens, incorporated lessons from the siege into governance. Inventories were tracked more carefully, barns and storehouses reinforced, and emergency plans drawn for future crises. These changes, quiet and methodical, would protect the city against both environmental and human threats for decades. Economically, the siege prompted minor but enduring shifts. Merchants and farmers recognized the importance of redundancy. Stockpiles were diversified, and routes for supply made more flexible. Even after the immediate threat ended, practices of rationing and careful record-keeping persisted. It is easy to dismiss these adjustments as mundane, but they reveal how boring acts of survival logistics, observation, and planning can ripple across years, subtly fortifying a city against uncertainty. The psychological imprint of the siege was equally significant. Citizens had endured monotony, uncertainty, and constant vigilance, developing a quiet resilience that informed future behavior. People had learned that crises were rarely resolved in a single moment of courage. Rather, survival often depended on patient, incremental work, careful observation, and cooperation. This slow-building endurance became part of the collective memory, shaping how Belgradiers approached subsequent challenges, from harsh winters to political instability. Interestingly, the enemy forces themselves unwittingly contributed to the city's lesson. By overlooking the barns in favor of more obvious military targets, they reinforced the idea that attention to mundane details, grain stores, timber supports, labor rotations could outweigh flashy displays of power. For the citizens of Belgrade, this reinforced an understanding that the ordinary and the overlooked could be just as decisive in determining outcomes as the spectacular or heroic. Life gradually returned to its normal pace. The barns, once the epicenter of tension and meticulous labor, resumed their routine function. Guards were reassigned, children returned to more carefree play, and markets reopened with familiar exchanges. Yet beneath the surface, the city had been quietly transformed. Citizens were more observant, more collaborative, and more capable of navigating disruption. Skills forged in repetition and patience now permeated daily life, an invisible infrastructure of resilience built during a siege that few historians would bother to mention. And so, as you imagine walking among the timbered barns, hearing the soft creak of boards settling after weeks of strain, and watching families carry out their daily chores, you might reflect on a larger truth. History is often made not in dramatic proclamations or battles, but in slow, unnoticed acts of endurance. The citizens of Belgrade, through careful attention to small details, subtle cooperation, and persistent effort, shaped the course of their city's survival. Their triumph was quiet, perhaps even boring to outsiders, yet it left a legacy of resilience, ingenuity, and communal strength that endured long after the last soldier departed. As you ponder the forgotten siege of Belgrade's barns, a question lingers. How many other overlooked acts of diligence, patience, and quiet problem-solving have quietly shaped cities, societies, and civilizations? How much of history, in truth, depends not on heroic moments, but on the ordinary, invisible labor that keeps life itself moving forward? Story 3. The day the library locked its doors. Florence, at the height of the Renaissance, was alive with sound. The clatter of merchants' carts, the chatter of apprentices in workshops, and the distant hum of scholars debating philosophy in sunlit piazzas. Yet in the heart of the city, within a building lined with wooden shelves, vellum manuscripts, and leather-bound books, an unusual stillness fell. It was a day like any other in early 1471, but to the people of Florence who depended on access to written knowledge, it became a moment of quiet crisis. The library, one of the city's most treasured repositories of learning, had been locked. The library was not vast by modern standards, yet it held the collective wisdom of centuries: classical texts, treatises on mathematics, religious manuscripts, and records of civic administration. Scholars, scribes, and students relied on its quiet corners to copy texts, consult references, or compose treatises of their own. When the doors closed unexpectedly due to bureaucratic indecision, a dispute over funding, and the reorganization of the city's custodianship, daily routines were abruptly interrupted. Those who had planned to spend the day immersed in study found themselves wandering corridors and courtyards, searching for alternative sources of information that simply did not exist. The reasons for the closure were banal, almost painfully ordinary. Officials debated responsibility for the building's maintenance. A window had been broken during a minor storm, and city funds had not yet been allocated for repair. The custodian, uncertain whether he had the authority to admit scholars, erred on the side of caution, locking the doors until clarity arrived. Outside the library, the street continued its usual bustle, yet within those wooden walls, silence reigned. Scholars, accustomed to a measured rhythm of study punctuated by scribbling quills and the turning of pages, were forced to wait, idle, or improvise. The impact of this seemingly minor event rippled in unexpected ways. Scholars who relied on the library's holdings found their work delayed, sometimes critically. A mathematician attempting to verify an astronomical calculation could not consult a key manuscript. A historian seeking the archives of local governance had to postpone analyses. Even minor interruptions, when multiplied across dozens of individuals, slowed the transmission of knowledge. Florence's intellectual ecosystem, usually so vibrant, paused not due to fire or invasion, but because of locked doors, unpaid repairs, and procedural ambiguity. Those inside the city had to improvise. Students resorted to copying from texts they already possessed, sometimes repeating errors in the absence of authoritative references. Scholars wrote letters to colleagues in other cities, hoping to access knowledge remotely, a slow and uncertain process in an age before postal reliability. Citizens who came to the library for practical purposes, such as reviewing property records or civic statutes, faced administrative delays that affected trade, legal disputes, and city governance. In this quiet, tedious way, a locked door began to influence the broader rhythms of life in Florence. Interestingly, the closure fostered a kind of ingenuity. Apprentices and young scholars, unable to access official holdings, turned to local patrons, private collections, or the memory of older teachers. They copied texts by hand from family libraries or private shelves, discovering forgotten manuscripts and compiling knowledge that might have otherwise remained unused. Inadvertently, the city's intellectual community became more networked, relying on interpersonal connections rather than institutional infrastructure. The locked library catalyzed an informal system of knowledge exchange, a testament to human adaptability in the face of minor bureaucratic obstacles. Yet the situation also highlighted vulnerabilities. The city's dependence on a single repository of knowledge underscored how fragile intellectual life could be. One simple act, the closing of a door, threatened to delay the work of multiple scholars, demonstrating that even Renaissance Florence, celebrated for its brilliance, depended on mundane logistics and careful management. For the administrators and custodians, the crisis prompted reflection. Could the city ensure continuity of access to knowledge if physical spaces were unreliable? Could scholars maintain intellectual productivity without institutional oversight or formal authority? Daily life outside the library continued, almost indifferent to the crisis inside. Merchants bartered and sold goods, artisans hammered and carved, and children played in sunlit courtyards. Yet within the library, the passage of time felt different, slower, more deliberate, punctuated by frustration, curiosity, and quiet observation. Scholars recorded what they could remember, sketched diagrams from memory, and debated abstractly in courtyards. This day, ordinary and unremarkable in many chronicles, became a lesson in patience, resourcefulness, and the often overlooked infrastructure of learning. As night fell over Florence, torches illuminating narrow streets and candlelight flickering in private rooms, one question lingered among the scholars and city officials alike. How many small interruptions, locked doors, delayed repairs, or misplaced manuscripts had quietly shaped the intellectual trajectory of the city? How much of what we celebrate as Renaissance brilliance depended not on sudden inspiration, but on the slow, methodical work required to preserve, access, and transmit knowledge across time and circumstance? The day after the library closed, the streets of Florence were unusually quiet, with scholars and students moving from place to place in search of alternatives. The city, normally a cacophony of debate, commerce, and artistic experimentation, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for access to the repository that had been unexpectedly denied. For many, the locked doors were more than an inconvenience. They represented the interruption of a carefully planned rhythm of study, reflection, and creation that shaped the intellectual heartbeat of the city. The impact was felt first among the city's mathematicians, astronomers, and engineers. Calculations delayed by missing manuscripts could mean errors in architectural planning, misaligned measurements in public works, or incorrect astronomical predictions relied upon for navigation. A young mathematician, poised to calculate the trajectory for a new canal system, found herself reliant on memory and incomplete sketches. Every page missing from the library's holdings became a small obstacle, forcing improvisation. Scholars, aware of the importance of precision, were forced to adapt, developing resilience and ingenuity under quiet, uncelebrated pressure. Meanwhile, historians and civic clerks discovered that daily governance relied heavily on access to the library's records. Property disputes could not be resolved without reference to land deeds stored on fragile parchment. Tax calculations, essential for municipal revenue, were delayed, leaving officials to make estimates based on memory or incomplete data. Even minor delays in information flow produced a ripple effect, subtly altering commerce, legal proceedings, and bureaucratic efficiency. What seems trivial to us, a locked door carried practical consequences for the city's functioning. In the courtyards and workshops surrounding the library, a new, informal network of knowledge exchange emerged. Scholars who had copies of texts or personal notes began lending them to others, creating a patchwork system of resource sharing. Apprentices transcribed what they could remember from previous visits, sometimes embellishing or summarizing ideas in ways that subtly altered interpretations. Private patrons opened their personal libraries to those in need, offering access to manuscripts that were rarely seen outside exclusive circles. Slowly, a decentralized system of intellectual collaboration arose, not in response to innovation, but to necessity. The closed library had forced the city's knowledge into motion in a new, less formalized way. This period also revealed the vulnerability of knowledge to human error and oversight. Custodians, bound by protocol, were hesitant to unlock doors without official approval. Records were misplaced, repairs delayed, and administrative inertia compounded the problem. These seemingly trivial lapses, absent-minded decisions, bureaucratic caution, or deferred responsibility had measurable consequences. Scholars were forced to navigate uncertainty, reconciling gaps in information and working around incomplete archives. In this way, the day the library locked its doors demonstrated how fragile intellectual progress can be when it depends on human systems as well as human thought. The closure affected not only academic work, but also social dynamics. Courtyards, cafes, and private residences became impromptu gathering places for discussion, debate, and instruction. Conversations that might have occurred quietly in the library now spilled into the streets, attracting new participants. Young apprentices overheard debates among older scholars, absorbing lessons in logic, rhetoric, and observation. A locked door, it seemed, had shifted the flow of knowledge from formal to informal channels, democratizing access in subtle ways. For all its inconvenience, the closure inadvertently fostered a broader, more interconnected intellectual community. At the same time, practical survival intertwined with intellectual adaptation. Students and scholars spent long hours in cold, dimly lit rooms copying texts from memory or preparing sketches for later consultation. Candlelight flickered over parchments, and quills scratched tirelessly across pages. Physical labor carrying manuscripts, repairing personal books, Even shoveling snow to reach distant patrons became inseparable from intellectual work. Florence's scholars, normally insulated within the mental realm, were reminded that access to knowledge relied on both infrastructure and human effort, not solely on brilliance or creativity. This period of enforced patience had lasting consequences. When the library finally reopened, it was not merely a return to normalcy. It was a transition into a city more conscious of the fragility and importance of its knowledge repositories. Scholars and officials began advocating for redundancies, duplicate manuscripts, secure storage, and clearer administrative protocols. They had learned that intellectual progress was slow not just because of the time it took to think or write, but because it depended on mundane logistics, locks, repairs, schedules, and human diligence. Knowledge, it turned out, required as much maintenance as a building or bridge. Yet questions lingered even after the doors swung open. How many insights had been delayed, lost, or reshaped by those hours of enforced inaccessibility? How many experiments, calculations, or arguments had been abandoned due to frustration or lack of resources? And more broadly, what does it mean for a society to depend so heavily on centralized repositories of knowledge, when one minor disruption, a broken window, a bureaucratic hesitation can temporarily halt intellectual life? By the time Florence's scholars regained full access, they had developed new habits of resilience, collaboration, and improvisation. The city had adapted to a small but significant crisis, learning lessons in patience, resourcefulness, and the fragility of systems of knowledge. The day the library locked its doors was, in itself, unremarkable. No battle was fought, no decree issued, no life lost. Yet the subtle consequences of that day rippled through the intellectual fabric of the city, quietly shaping the ways people studied, collaborated, and preserved information for generations to come. And so, as you imagine yourself packing the corridors outside the locked library, quill in hand, notebook under arm, pondering which manuscript to consult first once the doors reopened, you might wonder, how many moments of intellectual delay, inconvenience, or oversight throughout history have quietly redirected the flow of knowledge? How much of human progress depends on ordinary people responding patiently, creatively, and diligently to minor, bureaucratic, or mundane interruptions that rarely make it into the historical record? When the library finally reopened its heavy wooden doors, a quiet sense of relief washed over Florence. Scholars returned with notebooks in hand, apprentices carried bundles of parchment, and clerks resumed the careful recording of civic data. The grand spectacle of Renaissance thought the debates, calculations, and scholarly experiments continued as if uninterrupted. Yet beneath the surface of daily routines, subtle changes had taken root, a testament to the city's encounter with the mundane but powerful forces of disruption. The closure had exposed the delicate infrastructure of knowledge. Scholars realized that even in an era celebrated for intellectual flourishing, access to information was never guaranteed. A single locked door, caused by a broken window or bureaucratic hesitation, could halt progress, delay discoveries, and force improvisation. Florence's thinkers were reminded that learning was not merely the product of individual brilliance, but depended on systems, logistics, and the cooperation of many people, custodians, scribes, patrons, and apprentices alike. In the aftermath, new practices emerged. Scholars began maintaining personal copies of important texts whenever possible, creating backups of vital information. Workshops and private collections were cataloged more systematically, and city administrators implemented clearer protocols for maintenance and access. Where previously knowledge had flowed primarily through centralized institutions, it now moved through networks, shared manuscripts, private libraries, and informal mentorship. The enforced pause had revealed vulnerabilities, but also catalyzed resilience and adaptability. Beyond logistics, the day of closure left a subtle psychological impact. Scholars learned patience, problem-solving, and flexibility. They developed the skill of working with incomplete information, improvising experiments, and preserving insights until proper resources became available. These were not dramatic lessons, nor were they celebrated in the histories of grand discoveries. Yet they were essential. Intellectual endurance, it seemed, was cultivated as much in waiting rooms and locked corridors as in the study of complex treatises or the composition of mathematical proofs. Social dynamics shifted as well. Informal networks grew stronger during the closure. Scholars exchanged knowledge through letters, private meetings, and shared transcription work. Apprentices who might otherwise have been observers were now participants in distributed problem-solving. The city's intellectual life, though slowed, became more collaborative, more interconnected. The temporary inconvenience of locked doors had inadvertently fostered a culture of cooperation and mutual reliance, shaping the character of Florentine scholarship for years to come. Perhaps most importantly, the event underscored the fragility and contingency of progress. History often highlights the flash of genius or the moment of discovery, yet Florence's brief interruption reminds us that progress is also vulnerable to minor delays, oversights, and mundane obstacles. A broken window, a hesitant custodian, or a misfiled ledger can ripple outward in ways that affect not only daily routines but the broader course of intellectual and civic life. In this light, the day the library locked its doors was not a failure, it was a revelation of the invisible labor required to sustain knowledge across generations. By the time regular access was restored, Florence had internalized lessons about patience, preparation, and redundancy. Scholars carried copies, archives were maintained more carefully, and the city developed informal networks that could continue to function even when official structures faltered. Knowledge, they learned, was never entirely secure, and its preservation required diligence, foresight, and the quiet cooperation of many hands. The locked doors, though a brief inconvenience, left a lasting imprint on the city's intellectual infrastructure and its culture of careful, meticulous scholarship. And so, as you imagine yourself entering the library at last, tracing the spines of manuscripts that survived centuries of use, you might reflect on this question. How many other moments in history, mundane, bureaucratic, or overlooked, have quietly shaped the flow of knowledge and the endurance of civilizations? How much of what we celebrate as progress depends not on dramatic breakthroughs, but on the patient, often boring, work of maintaining, preserving, and adapting knowledge under imperfect, fragile conditions? Florence's scholars learned, in a single locked day, that even the smallest interruptions can leave profound traces across generations. Story 4. A candle that burned for weeks. In 17th century Paris, nights were long, streets were dim, and light was precious. Candles were not merely objects of convenience, they were lifelines for work, study, and survival. Yet most candles burned quickly, their wax consumed in hours, leaving scholars, artisans, and ordinary citizens in darkness. It was against this backdrop that a modest experiment quietly captured attention, a candle that burned not for hours but for weeks. The candle was the invention, or perhaps the meticulous refinement, of an obscure Parisian chemist and candlemaker, whose name has been lost to history. He was neither famous nor celebrated. His life was slow, deliberate, and entirely devoted to observation and careful manipulation of materials. The candle was crafted from a precise blend of tallow and beeswax, infused with resins and oils, and molded in a controlled manner to ensure consistent combustion. Each small detail mattered: wick thickness, wax density, ambient temperature, and even the direction of airflow around the flame. When first lit, the candle glowed like any other. But observers soon noticed something remarkable. The flame persisted, steady and low, consuming its wax at a fraction of the expected rate. Hours passed, days passed, weeks passed. Scholars, artisans, and householders gathered in small circles, noting the flame's behavior, documenting its characteristics and considering what such sustained light might mean for practical life in a city that often fell dark with early sunsets and narrow streets. For ordinary Parisians, the implications were immediate. Longer-lasting candles meant extended work hours for craftsmen laboring late into the evening, increased time for study by apprentices and scholars, and safer streets as households could illuminate corridors, stairwells, and outdoor paths without fear of sudden darkness. A single, small object, the candle, quietly reshaped daily routines. The impact was not dramatic in the way of armies or treaties, yet it influenced the rhythm of urban life in subtle, persistent ways. The chemist's workshop became a place of slow experimentation. He adjusted wick size, varied proportions of wax and tallow, and tested different additives for odor, smoke production, and flame stability. Observers noted the difference between candles that burned evenly and those that sputtered or smoked excessively. Each small observation was recorded meticulously, often in cramped notebooks filled with charts, sketches, and calculations. The work was painstakingly slow, almost boring in its repetitiveness. Yet it was precisely this methodical attention that produced results others could not replicate. Interestingly, the candle's effects extended beyond mere illumination. With a constant light source, artisans could complete detailed work engraving, lace-making, bookbinding through long winter nights. Scholars could study texts that had been previously inaccessible after sunset. Families could engage in sewing, reading, or conversation with less dependence on daylight. The candle created a new temporal space, a slow, measured expansion of productive hours that shaped social and economic life in ways that few outside the workshops noticed. But the experiment also carried risks and uncertainties. If the flame was too small, it would extinguish prematurely. If the wax mixture was imperfect, it could melt irregularly or produce noxious fumes. Each candle was a delicate balance between material composition, environment, and human technique. Mastery required patience, repeated observation, and meticulous recording of outcomes. Mistakes were common and often invisible. A slightly thinner wick could cause the candle to burn unevenly, wasting wax and jeopardizing reliability. In a world dependent on fire for light, such small failures could have outsized consequences, forcing scholars and artisans alike to remain attentive, deliberate, and careful. The broader significance of the candle became apparent in unexpected ways. Households that adopted the long-burning candles found their routines subtly altered. Children completed homework that previously had been impossible in the dim glow of ordinary tallow candles. Craftsmen extended hours without straining their eyes. Even the rhythms of social interaction shifted. Evening gatherings lasted longer, conversations deepened, and the perception of time itself seemed stretched by the constant, steady flame. What might appear as a trivial technical innovation quietly reshaped urban life, influencing patterns of work, learning, and domesticity. Yet, despite its apparent success, the candle posed a philosophical and practical question. Could such innovation be replicated at scale? While the chemist's workshop produced individual candles with extraordinary longevity, mass production was slow, inconsistent, and costly. Many citizens could not afford to acquire the precise materials or techniques. For every candle that burned for weeks, dozens of ordinary candles continued to flicker and fade within hours. The experiment highlighted the gap between isolated ingenuity and societal transformation, a slow, painstaking reminder that even brilliant solutions may take time to disseminate widely. As nights lengthened over Paris, the candle's quiet influence grew. Its light illuminated not only streets and workshops, but also the slow process of observation, experimentation, and learning. It reminded observers that small, methodical interventions, careful attention to detail, patience in execution, and willingness to endure repetition could ripple outward into daily life, shaping routines, habits, and the course of ordinary existence. The flame burned steadily, a beacon of both illumination and subtle historical significance. And as you imagine the warm, steady glow of a single candle in a Parisian workshop, casting shadows on wooden beams and parchment, you might wonder, how many small, boring innovations crafted patiently and observed carefully have quietly transformed human life? How often do ordinary people, through meticulous attention and repetitive labor, create shifts in daily existence that historians rarely notice, yet which endure far longer than the most celebrated events of their era? As the long-burning candle became known, its quiet influence spread slowly throughout Paris. In workshops, the artisans who had first observed the candle's steady glow began experimenting themselves. They adjusted the ratio of tallow to beeswax, experimented with different wick sizes, and sought additives to enhance burn time and minimize smoke. Each iteration was painstaking, involving hours of careful observation, noting how the flame behaved in drafts, how quickly the wax melted, and how different oils altered the odor or light intensity. These were repetitive, tedious efforts, yet they formed the foundation of a subtle technological evolution in everyday life. For the city's laborers and craftsmen, the candle offered more than convenience. It created opportunity. A shoemaker could complete delicate stitching late into the evening, a scribe could copy manuscripts without straining his eyes, and a metalworker could continue fine engraving work well past sunset. In workshops and studios, the persistent light became a tool of productivity. Unlike the sudden, fleeting brilliance of fireworks or celebratory lights, this glow was mundane yet essential. It reshaped daily routines in a quiet, almost imperceptible way, emphasizing the slow accumulation of small advantages over dramatic leaps in skill or efficiency. In households, the long-burning candle had a profound social effect. Families could extend evening activities reading, sewing, tutoring without worrying that darkness would force an early end. The candle created space for learning, reflection, and social interaction that had previously been constrained by limited light. Children's education subtly benefited, apprentices could practice longer, and domestic routines adjusted to accommodate this new resource. The flame illuminated both physical and intellectual space, turning ordinary rooms into microcosms of extended human effort and observation. Yet the candle's slow influence was not without challenges. Consistent production of such long-burning candles required careful knowledge of materials, patience, and precision. Not every household or workshop could achieve the perfect blend of tallow, beeswax, and resin. Many candles failed, burning too quickly or producing excessive smoke. The discrepancy highlighted a key lesson. Innovation was not merely about invention, but about reproducibility, attention to detail, and methodical practice. This slow, meticulous work was invisible in most histories, yet it shaped the distribution and reliability of technological advances in tangible ways. Beyond practical applications, the candle subtly influenced cultural practices. Scholars and philosophers gathered by its steady light to discuss abstract ideas, extending debates into the night without fear of interruption. Artists experimented with late-night sketches and painting, exploring shadow and form under consistent illumination. Even the perception of time shifted. Evenings stretched longer, thoughts deepened, and the pace of intellectual and creative work slowed in a measured, contemplative rhythm. The city's tempo, ordinarily dictated by sunrise and sunset, subtly adapted to the steady persistence of human-crafted light. The candle also became a quiet symbol of experimentation and observation. Its creator, though largely anonymous, demonstrated the value of patience, repetition, and careful documentation. Each candle represented not a flash of genius, but the accumulation of careful trials, each slightly better than the last. Observers learned that incremental improvements, grounded in methodical attention to detail, could create significant practical impact over time. In this way, the candle was a lesson in both material science and human perseverance. Even in the most ordinary settings, small innovations could ripple outward to affect countless lives. Interestingly, the candle also revealed broader socioeconomic dynamics. Wealthier households and workshops could afford the precision-made long-burning candles, while ordinary citizens often relied on shorter, cheaper versions. This discrepancy created subtle distinctions in productivity, learning opportunities, and evening activity. Yet it also encouraged knowledge sharing. Skilled candlemakers began instructing apprentices, exchanging techniques through observation and mentorship. Over time, the ability to produce reliable, long-lasting candles slowly spread, demonstrating how methodical skill, observation, and labor could democratize access to technological improvements, even in a stratified society. The slow transformation wrought by the candle extended beyond the household or workshop. City streets became slightly safer after dark, as more households kept windows and doorways illuminated. Late-night gatherings and small-scale commerce could continue with less interruption. Even the rhythm of city governance, reliant on scribes, clerks, and administrators, benefited from extended working hours. In each case, the candle was neither celebrated nor spectacular. It did not dominate chronicles or inspire grand paintings, but it reshaped the city's daily life in subtle, enduring ways. And yet, despite these innovations and adaptations, one question lingered among observers: how much of human progress depends on persistent, repetitive effort rather than dramatic leaps or sudden insight? How many lives, routines, and small social structures were transformed not by grand inventions, but by careful, deliberate refinement, by a flame that burned week after week, patiently illuminating both work and thought? As weeks passed, the long-burning candle became more than a novelty in Paris. It became a quiet instrument of change. Households, workshops, and scholars began integrating it into daily life in ways that were gradual, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly enduring. Where once darkness had dictated the rhythm of work, study, and domestic life, now a single flame extended the evening hours, allowing careful attention, reflection, and labor to continue steadily, hour after hour. The candle's steady illumination encouraged a rhythm of life that was both slow and deliberate. Scholars recorded observations late into the night, artisans completed intricate work without fear of interruption, and families engaged in quiet conversations or reading under its glow. These mundane but persistent activities fostered learning, skill development, and social cohesion. Unlike grand inventions that reshape society dramatically, this candle reshaped daily life through repetition, patience, and attention to minor details. It was an example of how the ordinary and boring could have long-lasting consequences. In workshops, the candle became a tool of experimentation and refinement. Craftsmen noted subtle variations in wax mixtures, wick behavior, and flame stability, slowly improving the reliability of their products. Apprentices learned meticulous habits, observing the small effects of minor adjustments in materials and technique. Each tiny improvement reinforced the lesson that consistent, careful labor rather than sudden inspiration was the key to sustainable innovation. Over time, the production of long-burning candles became more widespread, ensuring that the quiet benefits of persistent light were available to an increasing portion of the population. The broader social impact was equally significant. Extended hours of light facilitated education, fostered communication, and strengthened networks of collaboration. Scholars could meet later in private study rooms, exchanging ideas, verifying calculations, and mentoring apprentices. Artisans could coordinate complex projects, complete detailed work, and develop new techniques. Even city administration benefited. Clerks, scribes, and municipal officials could work later without relying on insufficient or inconsistent light. The candle, a small object of wax and tallow, became an invisible backbone for productivity, learning, and social cohesion. At the same time, the candle illuminated a deeper truth about human ingenuity. Progress often arises from repetitive, patient effort rather than grand, dramatic acts. Its creation required careful observation, incremental testing, and repeated attention to detail. Its impact, though subtle, spread gradually, reshaping the routines and capabilities of those who relied upon it. In this way, the candle exemplified a historical principle often overlooked. The accumulation of small, deliberate improvements can quietly influence the course of daily life, even in societies celebrated for their brilliance. Yet despite its practical benefits, the candle also underscored the fragility of innovation. Only through continued diligence, careful attention to materials, and methodical practice could the flame persist reliably. A minor error, a poorly adjusted wick, an impure wax batch, or insufficient resins could render the candle ineffective. The flame's endurance depended on patience, skill, and perseverance, reminding observers that even minor innovations require maintenance, oversight, and repeated care. In other words, brilliance alone was not enough. Survival, productivity, and progress depended on the slow, often boring labor of refinement. By the time the long-burning candle had entered widespread use, its influence was woven into the fabric of Parisian life. Extended study hours, increased productivity in workshops, and safer, better-lit homes became ordinary realities. Scholars and artisans internalized lessons in attention, patience, and careful observation. Society had adjusted, subtly but profoundly, to a new rhythm of life, guided by a single, persistent flame. The candle had illuminated more than rooms. It had illuminated the principle that small, careful, repeated actions can shape the structure of daily existence and the continuity of knowledge and craft. And so, as you imagine the faint glow of the long-burning candle in a dim Parisian workshop, flickering gently across parchment, wood, and wax, consider this. How many seemingly minor innovations in history, crafted patiently, observed carefully, and refined repeatedly, have quietly reshaped the rhythms of human life? How often do ordinary acts of perseverance, repetition, and attention to detail leave an invisible yet enduring mark on society, outlasting the spectacular feats and celebrated breakthroughs that history prefers to remember? In the quiet warmth of a single candle's flame, the subtle power of boring history becomes unmistakably clear. Story 5. The Day the Town Clock Stopped. Aldenbrook was a town defined by rhythm. Market bells, church chimes, and the steady tick of its central clock coordinated the lives of merchants, craftsmen, farmers, and schoolchildren alike. The town clock, a towering structure of iron and wood in the main square, was more than a timepiece. It was a central organizer of daily life. When it stopped one unremarkable spring morning in 1723, the consequences were subtle, mundane, and yet surprisingly profound. The first sign of trouble was almost imperceptible, a gentle halt of the minute hand, unnoticed by anyone in particular. Merchants arranged stalls according to their usual schedule, assuming the clock's silence was temporary. Artisans in workshops glanced at the tower but carried on, relying on habitual routines rather than precise timing. Even the town council, preoccupied with routine administrative matters, assumed the clock would resume its function shortly. Yet as hours stretched into a full day, the absence of reliable time began to expose the fragile dependence of Aldenbrook's social and economic systems on a single mechanism. Without the steady rhythm of the clock, subtle chaos crept into everyday life. Market schedules became inconsistent. Buyers arrived too early or too late. Vendors missed optimal trading times, and some perishable goods lingered in stalls longer than intended. Artisans working by habit discovered that coordination with apprentices faltered. Deliveries of raw materials, timed to coincide with precise openings of workshops, were delayed or mismatched. Even communal prayer, synchronized with the chimes of the bell, lost its orderly cadence, creating confusion among townspeople who had relied on auditory cues for centuries. The town's clockmaker, a quiet and meticulous man named Henry, was called upon to repair the mechanism. He spent hours atop ladders, inspecting gears, weights, and pendulums. Dust, wear, and a misaligned escapement were revealed as the culprit. The work was painstaking. Each cog needed careful adjustment, each weight balanced precisely, and the pendulum's swing regulated to fractions of a second. From below, the townspeople waited in anxious idleness, unaware of the complexity of what they considered a simple, familiar device. For Henry, this was a test of patience and precision, a reminder that even routine objects relied on slow, deliberate craftsmanship to function properly. The interruption had ripple effects beyond commerce and worship. Children arrived at school at inconsistent times, disrupting lessons and routines. Bakers, dependent on early morning hours for kneading dough and baking bread, were thrown off schedule, leaving households waiting or improvising. Farmhands, guided by the clock to coordinate the transport of goods from fields to town, missed key timings, creating minor shortages. Life, ordinarily governed by predictable sequences, became irregular, highlighting the subtle yet critical influence of a single mechanism on communal life. Interestingly, the clock's failure also encouraged adaptability. Citizens began relying on secondary indicators of time: sunlight through windows, the crow of roosters, and even the natural rhythms of neighboring rivers and mills. Apprentices learned to estimate intervals by observation. Merchants coordinated using personal schedules rather than public signals, and families developed informal cues to structure meals and work. Inadvertently, the town became more attuned to natural rhythms and interpersonal coordination, relying less on a single technological anchor and more on observation, memory, and collaboration. The clock itself became a quiet symbol of human ingenuity and vulnerability. Though sturdy, impressive, and central to town life, it was also dependent on careful maintenance, skilled craftsmanship, and attention to detail. The breakdown revealed how fragile social coordination can be when reliant on a single point of reference. Aldenbrook's daily rhythm, usually so precise and taken for granted, had been disrupted not by war, disease, or disaster, but by a misaligned gear and a pendulum out of tune. As the day wore on, the townspeople became increasingly aware of how much of their lives had been structured by the clock's steady beat. They realized that even minor deviations in timekeeping could cascade into broader inefficiencies, misunderstandings, and frustration. They observed the intricate labor of the clockmaker with renewed respect, recognizing that the ordinary and technical, the maintenance of gears and weights, was essential to the smooth functioning of communal life. By evening, Henry had corrected the misalignment. The pendulum resumed its steady swing, gears clicked into rhythm, and the hands began their measured progression once more. The market, workshops, and town square gradually returned to normal. Yet, for those who had spent the day in uncertainty, the experience left a subtle imprint. The town had glimpsed the delicate interdependence of human systems on seemingly mundane mechanisms, and the lessons learned would quietly shape behavior in the weeks, months, and years to come. And as you imagine standing in Aldenbrook Square, watching the hands of the repaired clock move steadily, you might ask yourself, how often has human life relied on small, unnoticed mechanisms, objects, routines, or structures whose failure can ripple quietly through daily existence? How much of what we take for granted depends on patience, craftsmanship, and the slow, meticulous maintenance of systems that almost nobody notices until they falter? The day the town clock stopped offers a quiet meditation on the hidden infrastructure of ordinary life. With the clock temporarily silent, Aldenbrook entered a strange, uneven rhythm. The town, normally governed by precise intervals, the tolling of the bell, the measured swing of the pendulum, the predictable chime announcing the hour, now relied on approximation, observation, and improvisation. Merchants, craftsmen, and townspeople quickly realized that their daily routines had been more tightly bound to the clock than they had imagined. Tasks that had always seemed automatic now required careful thought, attention, and coordination. Markets became a microcosm of this disruption. Vendors, uncertain of when customers would arrive, opened stalls at varying times. Some prepared early, leaving goods exposed to weather or premature consumption. Others arrived late, missing critical hours of trade. Buyers wandered from stall to stall, uncertain if they had arrived on time or missed the prime window for transactions. Small economic inefficiencies emerged: unsold perishable goods, misaligned trades, delayed deliveries, but they were subtle, almost imperceptible, affecting the town in ways that felt trivial at first yet compounded over the course of the day. Workshops faced similar challenges. Artisans and apprentices relied on the clock to structure their labor, measuring intervals for processes like drying paints, kneading dough, or tempering metals. Without a reliable external signal, apprentices had to estimate elapsed time by observation alone, often with inconsistent results. Simple errors: overbaked bread, improperly cured metal, uneven paint layers were multiplied when work had to be coordinated across multiple craftsmen. Supervisors were forced to pay closer attention to each step, sometimes slowing production to compensate for human error. What might seem mundane, the lack of a ticking clock, revealed how deeply technological and temporal systems underpinned daily life. Even civic functions were subtly altered. Clerks managing tax records, property deeds, and public announcements relied on the clock to schedule work and appointments. Without it, delays occurred in office operations, correspondence with neighboring towns faltered, and meetings began inconsistently. A town that had always moved with precise timing now operated in an improvisational mode, with citizens learning to rely on personal schedules, natural indicators, or mutual observation. Over time, these improvisations created a kind of resilience. People developed the skill to maintain order and coordination, even when technological support failed. The disruption also fostered new social behaviors. Citizens began checking in with one another to confirm timing for gatherings. Apprentices asked mentors for verbal cues rather than following the clock, and families coordinated meals and chores based on observation of sunlight and local routines. The town, forced to rely on interpersonal cues rather than mechanical precision, became more attentive to small human signals. It was a subtle recalibration, revealing the hidden infrastructure of social coordination that underlies even the most orderly communities. Interestingly, the clock's breakdown highlighted the intricate skill of the clockmaker. Henry, the town's quiet artisan, became central not only for his repair work but for the maintenance of social order itself. Townspeople watched carefully as he inspected gears, realigned escapements, and adjusted the pendulum with painstaking precision. The process was slow, repetitive, and exacting, requiring deep focus and accumulated expertise. Observing him, citizens came to understand that smooth social functioning relied on technical knowledge and meticulous labor that often went unnoticed until a failure occurred. The town also learned to observe time differently. Without the mechanical guidance of the clock, citizens turned to natural indicators: the sun's position in the sky, shadows cast across streets, and the crowing of roosters or the ringing of distant bells. These methods, while less precise, cultivated attentiveness, patience, and observational skill. Tasks became linked more closely to natural rhythms and interpersonal coordination, fostering resilience against future disruptions. Even after the clock was repaired, this adaptation persisted, quietly shaping habits, awareness, and human cooperation. By the end of the day, Aldenbrook had experienced both the fragility and the adaptability of its systems. A single misaligned gear, a stopped pendulum, and a silent bell had revealed how deeply daily life depended on coordination, timing, and technical expertise. Yet it also showed how human ingenuity and cooperation could compensate for such failures. People improvised, observed, and collaborated, ensuring that the town continued to function despite the absence of its central temporal reference. And so, as you imagine Aldenbrook's streets, workshops, and markets operating out of sync, you might consider a quiet lesson: how much of ordinary life depends on the hidden precision of objects, tools, and routines. How often do small failures, misaligned mechanisms, overlooked maintenance, or minor delays force people to adapt, revealing resilience that is rarely recorded in history? The day the town clock stopped reminds us that the invisible labor and careful observation behind daily coordination are as essential to civilization as the events we celebrate in chronicles. By the following morning, Henry, the town's meticulous clockmaker, had completed the repairs. The pendulum swung with steady precision, gears meshed smoothly, and the bell resumed its reliable toll. At first glance, Aldenbrook seemed to have returned to normal. Market stalls opened on time, workshops resumed their routines, children arrived punctually at school, and the rhythm of civic life resumed its familiar cadence. Yet beneath the restored order, the town had undergone a subtle transformation, one born from a day of interruption and adaptation. The pause revealed the delicate interdependence of daily life. Citizens realized how deeply they had relied on the clock, not merely as a timekeeping device, but as a foundation for social, economic, and civic coordination. Even minor deviations, a pendulum out of alignment or a gear misaligned by a fraction, could ripple through the town, subtly affecting trade, work, and community interactions. The event underscored a truth often overlooked in historical accounts, that small, precise mechanisms, maintained quietly and carefully, are central to the smooth functioning of human societies. Yet the disruption also highlighted the town's resilience. In the absence of mechanical guidance, Aldenbrook's residents had adapted. They relied on observation, natural rhythms, and collaboration to coordinate their daily activities. Markets continued, though with minor inefficiencies. Workshops produced goods, though with greater reliance on memory and verbal cues. Families structured meals and chores using shared signals rather than bells. This improvisation revealed a hidden strength. Ordinary people possess the capacity to adapt to failures in infrastructure, provided they observe carefully, communicate effectively, and apply patience in repetition. Henry's role, too, gained new significance. The townspeople came to appreciate that the smooth operation of the clock, and by extension, the town's daily order, depended on careful, methodical labor. His painstaking adjustments, often unnoticed during routine operation, became visible in the wake of disruption. They highlighted the quiet expertise required to maintain systems that most people take for granted, emphasizing that ordinary labor, attention to detail, and patient observation are foundational to society. The experience left lasting behavioral changes. Citizens became more observant of natural signs of time, the sun's position, shadows, and environmental cues. Workshops and households developed small redundancies, such as personal hourglasses, sundials, and informal schedules, to ensure continuity in case of future interruptions. Even after the clock resumed function, people retained the memory of a day when their routines were disrupted, cultivating patience, adaptability, and attentiveness to both human and mechanical systems. Interestingly, the event also reshaped social relationships. Apprentices became more engaged observers, learning to estimate time independently rather than relying solely on the clock. Merchants communicated more directly with each other about schedules, coordinating arrivals and departures without depending exclusively on the central bell. Families negotiated household routines with increased awareness of contingencies. In subtle ways, the town became more interconnected, resilient, and self-reliant, all because of a day when a single clock stopped. Over time, historians and chroniclers would likely overlook this episode. There was no battle, no political upheaval, no dramatic calamity, only a broken gear, a silent pendulum, and citizens adjusting quietly to maintain daily life. Yet for Aldenbrook, the experience was instructive. It illustrated the profound importance of patience, meticulous maintenance, and communal observation. It revealed how even minor failures can reveal vulnerabilities and prompt the development of resilience, preparation, and adaptability. As the clock resumed its measured ticking, the town returned to its familiar patterns, but the lessons endured. Life depends on small, precise systems maintained with care. Ordinary people possess the capacity to adapt under quiet pressure, and the hidden labor of observation, adjustment, and repetition is often as consequential as any celebrated historical event. The day the town clock stopped was mundane, even boring, yet it quietly reshaped the rhythm of daily life, leaving an enduring mark on the community that would last long after the gears were realigned. And as you imagine Aldenbrook Square, the bell once again ringing reliably, you might reflect: how much of history, progress, and civilization depends on small, unnoticed mechanisms and the patient, careful labor that keeps them functioning? How many moments of quiet disruption have reshaped ordinary life, teaching lessons that are invisible in the grand narratives of battles and rulers, but essential to human survival and social order? Story 6. The Day the River Refused to Freeze. In the winter of 1782, the small town of Lichtenwald, nestled along a meandering river in Central Europe, experienced an unusual and unsettling phenomenon. The river refused to freeze. For decades, citizens had relied on the river's predictable freeze during the coldest months. Ice allowed them to traverse from one bank to another, to gather wood and firewood trapped on small islands, and to maintain a routine rhythm of fishing, trade, and social interaction. When temperatures dipped, the river solidified like clockwork, a silent but dependable marker of winter's progression. That year, however, the ice never formed. At first, the townspeople were puzzled rather than alarmed. Children, who typically skated along the frozen surface, poked sticks into slushy patches, finding only moving water beneath their feet. Fishermen, accustomed to cutting holes in the ice for winter catch, were forced to abandon nets and traps. For farmers, the frozen river had served as a natural pathway to distant pastures and communal barns. Its absence disrupted transportation of livestock, firewood, and grain. Even the local mill, which relied on the predictable flow of winter water and ice for certain operations, faced minor inefficiencies. The implications of a river that refused to freeze extended beyond inconvenience. Merchants relied on the ice to move heavy carts and barrels across the river, reducing risk and labor. With open water, they had to use boats in treacherous conditions, risking life and cargo. Families attempting to visit relatives on the opposite bank found themselves stranded, and small-scale trade of food, firewood, and other necessities slowed. The rhythms of the town, which had evolved over generations to coincide with predictable winter patterns, were suddenly disrupted by a simple anomaly in nature. Locals quickly realized that adaptation was necessary. Makeshift ferries were built, ropes strung across the river for hand-pulled transport, and temporary walkways improvised with logs and planks. Fishermen experimented with floating nets and suspended traps. Children, who had previously skated or slid across ice, now ran along the riverbanks or improvised snow-covered paths for games. Each adjustment was a minor experiment, a small, repeated act of observation and trial to cope with a changing environment. Life continued, but with a heightened awareness of fragility and contingency. For scholars and chroniclers in Lichtenwald, the unfrozen river became an object of curiosity. Local naturalists observed the flow, measuring currents and noting temperature fluctuations. They speculated about causes: unusually warm air temperatures, shifts in upstream water sources, or early spring conditions. Their notes, often dense and tedious, recorded daily observations of water level, flow speed, and ambient temperatures. Though the work seemed boring to outsiders, these careful records contributed to a growing understanding of hydrology, climate patterns, and the relationship between natural systems and human society. Interestingly, the river's refusal to freeze revealed the interconnectedness of natural and social systems. Ordinary routines transporting goods, tending livestock, visiting neighbors, conducting business depended on predictable environmental behavior. When the ice failed to form, the fragility of these systems became apparent. Citizens discovered that human schedules, previously synchronized with natural patterns, required improvisation, observation, and patience. The unfrozen river, though not catastrophic, quietly exposed vulnerabilities in societal reliance on predictable natural rhythms. Life continued as it always does, but slower, more deliberate, and carefully adapted to the unusual conditions. Farmers learned to transport smaller loads at more frequent intervals to avoid overtaxing ferries. Fishermen experimented with different techniques, observing how currents shifted in response to fluctuating temperatures. Children adapted their play, inventing games along safer shores. Even merchants developed contingency plans, noting how small deviations in river conditions could ripple outward, affecting trade and supply. Each day required attentiveness and incremental adjustment. As the weeks stretched on, the river remained free of ice. Lichtenwald, forced into improvisation, developed resilience. Its citizens learned patience, flexibility, and the value of repeated observation. Minor failures lost fish. Delayed deliveries, treacherous crossings became lessons in adaptation. In the absence of the usual winter patterns, ordinary people discovered the subtle but profound ways environmental anomalies shape social, economic, and personal life. And as you imagine standing on the riverbank, watching dark water swirl beneath a gray winter sky, you might reflect. How much of human life depends on predictable natural patterns, and how often do small disruptions rivers that do not freeze, whether that behaves differently than expected, force societies to adapt quietly and patiently. How many unnoticed adjustments, improvisations, and careful observations have shaped communities across history, leaving a mark that few chronicles ever record. As the days of winter lengthened and the river remained stubbornly liquid, Lichtenwald citizens began to realize that improvisation would no longer suffice for short-term adjustments. They needed systematic adaptation. The town had always relied on the frozen river as a predictable infrastructure, a natural bridge that shaped transportation, trade, and social interaction. With the ice gone, every routine, every rhythm of daily life required recalibration. Fishermen were among the first to confront the challenge directly. Without ice, their traditional methods of drilling holes and setting traps for winter fish were impossible. Some turned to floating nets, suspending them from small boats tethered to the banks, while others experimented with temporary rafts to anchor traps in deeper water. These modifications were slow, labor-intensive, and often unsuccessful. Fish were lost to strong currents, nets tore, and boats capsized in minor gusts of wind. Yet over time, small innovations emerged. Sturdier rafts, more effective anchoring systems, and careful observation of water currents allowed the fishermen to maintain a modest catch. It was a lesson in patient problem-solving and incremental improvement. Farmers faced similar logistical challenges. Livestock that would normally cross frozen sections of the river now required careful ferrying or longer routes over bridges. Grain transport, which had previously taken advantage of frozen shortcuts, became riskier and slower. Farmers divided loads into smaller portions, staggered trips, and relied on teams of helpers to maintain stability on makeshift rafts or narrow plank crossings. These adaptations demanded not just physical labor, but coordination, observation, and the quiet planning that turned everyday survival into a deliberate, methodical activity. Merchants and traders, whose profits depended on timing and predictability, had to rethink their schedules entirely. Goods that had once moved quickly across the ice now required ferries, pulleys, and temporary walkways. Delays were inevitable, yet over weeks, traders developed contingency strategies, stockpiling, staggered deliveries, and reliance on local buyers to minimize transportation needs. What initially seemed like a frustrating inconvenience became a catalyst for developing more resilient supply chains, small, incremental adjustments that would benefit the town even after the river's behavior returned to normal. Children and households adapted as well. Skating and ice-bound games were abandoned, replaced with new outdoor activities along the riverbanks or improvised indoor play. Families adjusted meal schedules and errands, carefully observing weather, river conditions, and daylight hours. Households that coordinated closely with neighbors for river crossings developed informal communication systems, signaling when boats or rafts were available, effectively creating a temporary social network shaped by necessity. The town's experience also had a subtle intellectual dimension. Local naturalists and scholars documented the river's unusual behavior, carefully recording daily water temperature, currents, and weather patterns. These boring observations, repetitive and painstaking, would later contribute to an early understanding of hydrology and climate variability. Students and apprentices were recruited to note minor details, measure fluctuations, and assist in cataloging results. The river's anomaly became a lesson in patient observation, careful recording, and the slow accumulation of knowledge. Perhaps most importantly, the unfrozen river revealed the interdependence of natural and human systems. The town's economy, social networks, and daily routines were all calibrated to predictable environmental patterns. When the river deviated from its expected behavior, small inefficiencies multiplied, forcing adaptation at every level. Ordinary people, fishermen, farmers, merchants, children became active participants in problem solving, inventing temporary solutions, observing outcomes, and refining methods. The event demonstrated that survival and prosperity often depended on careful attention to the environment and deliberate, patient labor, rather than dramatic interventions. By the third week of this unusual winter, Lichtenwold had developed a new rhythm. Citizens moved more cautiously, worked more deliberately, and observed the river with renewed attentiveness. Daily life, though slower and more labor-intensive, continued with a measured resilience. The town's social fabric strengthened through shared improvisation and cooperation, while incremental innovations improved ferries, anchored nets, and better communication systems ensured continuity in the face of environmental uncertainty. Yet the situation remained unresolved in subtle ways. How long would the river continue to resist freezing? Would these adaptations suffice if the anomaly persisted through midwinter or early spring? And what other environmental irregularities might test the town's routines, patience, and ingenuity in the years to come? Lichtenwold citizens learned that history is shaped not only by grand events, but also by small, persistent challenges that demand observation, improvisation, and quiet endurance. As you imagine walking along the riverbank, watching icy slush swirl beneath dark, flowing water, you might ask yourself, how often do ordinary people, confronted with minor but persistent environmental anomalies, quietly invent new routines, tools, and social systems? How much of history depends on such slow, methodical adaptation, unnoticed by chroniclers yet critical to human survival and progress? As winter deepened, Lichtenwold gradually adapted to life on an unfrozen river. What had begun as puzzling and frustrating uncertainty had become a slow, methodical restructuring of the town's routines, labor practices, and social networks. Citizens developed new strategies for transportation, trade, and survival, relying on improvisation, observation, and cooperation to replace the natural rhythms they had once taken for granted. The river, refusing to solidify, became an unexpected teacher, quietly reshaping the habits, skills, and awareness of everyone it touched. Fishermen perfected their floating nets and raft-based traps, learning to anticipate currents and the behavior of fish under unseasonably warm conditions. Farmers transported livestock and grain with improved techniques, carefully balancing loads and coordinating trips to maximize safety and efficiency. Merchants implemented staggered schedules and stockpiling strategies, ensuring that trade continued despite delayed crossings. Even children adapted, inventing new forms of play along the banks and within homes. Each incremental adjustment, though unremarkable on its own, accumulated into a resilient system that sustained the town through a winter that defied expectation. The experience also had subtle social consequences. Citizens developed more effective communication, coordinating crossings, work shifts, and deliveries in ways that previously had been unnecessary. Shared labor became a norm. Neighbors assisted one another with ferries, logs, and supplies, strengthening communal bonds. Apprentices and younger members of the town observed and recorded details of river behavior, contributing to practical knowledge and learning patience, attentiveness, and the importance of careful observation. The anomaly revealed the quiet ways that ordinary people, acting collectively and patiently, preserve and adapt society in response to environmental challenges. Intellectually, the unfrozen river became an object of study. Local naturalists meticulously recorded water levels, temperature variations, and flow patterns, seeking to understand why the river refused to freeze. Their notes, repetitive and painstaking, contributed to early ideas about climate variability and hydrology, although the importance of their observations would only be recognized decades later. In this way, a mundane anomaly, a river that did not freeze, became a driver of knowledge accumulation, patience, and slow scientific inquiry. The long-term lessons extended beyond the immediate winter. Lichtenwold's residents realized that their society depended not just on human labor, but also on predictable natural patterns. Minor disruptions, whether environmental, mechanical, or social, could ripple through everyday life in ways that were not immediately obvious. The town learned to build small redundancies, develop adaptive strategies, and cultivate patience and attentiveness, recognizing that slow, repetitive effort often mattered more than dramatic intervention. In this way, the unfrozen river became a metaphor for history itself, a reminder that resilience and survival are cultivated quietly, in response to persistent but unremarkable challenges. Eventually, winter gave way to spring, and the river resumed its usual cycles. Ice formed in the cold months thereafter, and normal routines returned. Yet the experience of a river that refused to freeze left an enduring imprint on the town. Citizens retained improved strategies for coordination, labor distribution, and communication. They had learned to observe carefully, anticipate change, and respond methodically. Ordinary people, through small, repeated efforts and careful attention, had preserved the functioning of their town and subtly strengthened its social fabric. As you imagine standing on the banks of a flowing river in winter, watching dark water swirl against the snowy shore, you might reflect, how many environmental anomalies have quietly shaped human society, forcing communities to invent new routines, tools, and methods of cooperation? How often does resilience arise not from dramatic heroism, but from patient observation, careful adaptation, and the slow accumulation of minor adjustments? The day the river refused to freeze reminds us that history is often written not in battles or declarations, but in the quiet, persistent ingenuity of ordinary people responding to circumstances they cannot control. Story 7. The year the bells went silent. In 1645, the town of Brackenridge, perched on a gentle hill overlooking a winding river, experienced a curious and unsettling anomaly. The bells went silent. These bells, perched in the town's central steeple, had rung faithfully for centuries, marking hours, announcing events, and guiding the rhythms of daily life. Farmers, merchants, students, and laborers relied on the tolling of iron and bronze to structure their days. When the bells fell silent, the town did not descend into chaos, but a subtle, pervasive disruption quietly unfolded. The silence was first noticed on a gray morning in early spring. Villagers arose at their usual hour, expecting the familiar peal to summon them to work, study, or prayer. Instead, nothing sounded. At first, they assumed a temporary malfunction. Perhaps the bell's clapper had worn or the rope had frayed. Yet as the hours passed, no sound emerged. Merchants waited to open stalls, hesitant to begin without the public cue. Farmers delayed trips to distant fields. Children hesitated before leaving home for lessons, unsure if it was the correct hour. Even the town council postponed meetings, awaiting the auditory signal that had always regulated civic order. The cause, eventually discovered, was mundane yet persistent. The main bell rope had frayed entirely, and the clapper mechanism required extensive repair. Reaching the top of the steeple demanded skill, precision, and courage. Only a few townspeople had the knowledge to ascend safely, inspect the massive bronze bell, and perform the delicate work needed to restore function. Meanwhile, life in Brackenridge continued, but the absence of sound subtly reshaped routines. People had always trusted the steady cadence of the bells. Now, they were forced to pay attention to alternative cues: sunlight, human observation, or personal schedules. Merchants and craftsmen, whose livelihood depended on coordination, felt the change acutely. Stall openings became staggered and inconsistent. Workshops struggled with timing, especially for labor that relied on collaboration. Apprentices arriving late or early caused interruptions in production, and deliveries of goods were misaligned. The town's markets, though still active, lost some efficiency. Small errors accumulated. Bread arrived before it could be sold, deliveries missed the optimal trading hours, and labor schedules required adjustment. What seemed like a minor mechanical failure had subtle consequences, exposing the town's deep reliance on auditory signals. Silence also affected social life. Religious observances, previously guided by bell tolls, became irregular. Citizens struggled to synchronize communal prayers, gatherings, and announcements. Children, accustomed to bell cues for lessons or chores, were temporarily unmoored. Even simple social rituals, visiting neighbors at expected hours, meeting at the town square, shifted. These adjustments were neither dramatic nor catastrophic, yet they required increased attention, planning, and cooperation. Life moved forward, but with a subtle layer of uncertainty. The town's clockmaker, a diligent artisan named Matthijs, took responsibility for restoring the bells. Ascending the steeple was a slow, careful process. Ropes were replaced with durable fibers, clappers were realigned, and minor cracks were inspected and reinforced. Each step required methodical attention. A slip could break the rope, crack the bell, or injure the worker. Observers watched silently from the square below, gaining a newfound appreciation for the labor required to maintain the instruments that had long gone unnoticed. Their dependence on the bells became tangible in a way that ordinary life rarely made visible. The unseen labor of maintenance underpinned the town's rhythm. Interestingly, the absence of sound encouraged alternative forms of coordination. Families and neighbors relied more on visual cues: lanterns in windows, smoke from chimneys, or movement along streets signaled activity. Merchants began communicating more directly with each other to coordinate schedules. Students and teachers devised informal timing methods, using sunlight and shadow as indicators for lessons. Over the weeks of silence, the town discovered a slower, more attentive way of living, one that depended less on a single mechanical signal and more on observation, collaboration, and patience. Yet the silence also raised questions about dependency and vulnerability. How many other systems, water, grain, or roads, relied on a single point of failure? How often did ordinary life depend on unnoticed mechanisms, human labor, and subtle processes that went unappreciated until failure occurred? The bells, while monumental and visible, were only one of many structures upon which the town's rhythm rested. Their silence illuminated the fragility of daily life and the quiet labor required to maintain the steady pulse of society. As you imagine standing in Brackenridge's square, hearing only the wind and footsteps where once bronze bells rang, you might wonder, how often do small disruptions, mechanical, environmental, or human, reshape routines quietly, forcing societies to observe, adapt, and collaborate? How many unnoticed acts of maintenance, patience, and careful attention sustain the life of a community every day, unnoticed until silence falls? As the days turned into weeks, Brackenridge adjusted to life without the familiar ringing of the town bells, but the adjustments were neither simple nor immediate. The absence of this once constant rhythm forced the citizens to confront the fragility of their routines, revealing just how much the town's daily life relied on a single auditory signal. Merchants were among the most affected. Market schedules, which had always depended on the chimes to signal opening and closing hours, now relied on memory, estimation, and coordination with peers. Some vendors arrived early, setting up stalls before customers were ready, leaving goods exposed to sun or rain. Others arrived late, missing key trading periods. This misalignment caused subtle inefficiencies. Produce spoiled, baked goods cooled before sale, and the flow of transactions lost the precision it had once enjoyed. To compensate, shopkeepers began using hand signals, lanterns, or verbal announcements to coordinate their schedules with neighbors, creating a quiet network of observation and communication that had previously been unnecessary. Artisans in workshops experienced similar disruptions. Many relied on bell tolls to measure intervals for repetitive tasks needing dough, curing leather, or tempering metal. Without a consistent auditory cue, apprentices and journeymen had to rely on intuition, memory, and makeshift timers. Errors became common: dough overbaked, leather cured too long, metals cooled inconsistently. Supervisors were forced to watch more closely, slowing production and increasing reliance on human observation rather than mechanical or habitual cues. Yet over time, these minor challenges strengthened skills in attention, patience, and coordination. Workers became more attuned to subtle signs: the feel of dough, the color of metal, or the smell of curing leather, learning to trust observation over habit. The absence of bells also affected social and religious life. Church services, previously scheduled around tolling hours, now began inconsistently, with parishioners relying on word of mouth or visual cues from neighbors. Students arrived at lessons at different times, and communal work parties or town meetings required negotiation and communication rather than automatic adherence to the familiar chimes. The town became more socially attentive, as individuals learned to read signals in the behavior of others and coordinate collectively. Ordinary routines, once predictable and unquestioned, demanded active participation and observation. Interestingly, the silent bells prompted the town to reconsider redundancy in daily life. Families and businesses developed private timing methods: sundials in courtyards, small hourglasses in homes and workshops, and improvised signals for coordinating communal tasks. Apprentices were assigned to monitor elapsed time during repetitive tasks, learning patience, meticulous observation, and the slow accumulation of practical knowledge. The quiet labor of observing, recording, and adapting became more visible, fostering an appreciation for the subtle structures that sustain daily life. The clockmaker Matthijs continued his careful repairs. Replacing ropes, adjusting clappers, and inspecting the bronze bell demanded precision, patience, and repeated testing. Townspeople watched with growing respect, realizing that the bell's function, its regularity, audibility, and durability, depended on a series of slow, deliberate actions often unnoticed until failure occurred. His work highlighted the importance of maintenance, repetition, and skilled labor, demonstrating that the smooth functioning of a community relies on careful attention to seemingly mundane details. As the weeks passed, a culture of attentiveness quietly took hold. Citizens communicated more directly with each other, coordinated tasks visually or verbally, and monitored the passage of time through natural or improvised indicators. Mistakes and delays remained, but the town adapted, discovering resilience in observation, collaboration, and patience. Life continued, but slower, more deliberate, and more reliant on human skill than on mechanical certainty. And yet, a lingering question remained. What other unnoticed systems supported the rhythms of daily life? How much of society depended on silent, patient labor, careful maintenance, and shared attention? And how often did these invisible structures go unrecognized until they failed? Brackenridge, forced into quiet adaptation, learned that civilization's continuity often relies on repetition, patience, and observation rather than on grand or dramatic events. As you imagine walking through the town square, empty of the familiar chimes, you might reflect, how often does ordinary life rely on unnoticed systems, and how many lessons in patience, collaboration, and observation remain hidden until silence forces awareness? The year the bells went silent reveals that history is not only shaped by dramatic moments, but also by the quiet, persistent work that sustains everyday life. Eventually, the day arrived when the bells of Brackenridge could toll once more. Matthijs, the patient clockmaker, completed the delicate repairs. The frayed ropes were replaced, the clapper aligned precisely, and the massive bronze bell was reinforced to withstand decades of future use. From the town square, the first resounding chime echoed across rooftops and cobblestones, a sound both familiar and profoundly reassuring. Life resumed its accustomed rhythm, or so it seemed. In the immediate aftermath, daily routine snapped back with a comforting familiarity. Market stalls opened on schedule, workshops followed their usual patterns, and children arrived punctually at lessons. Yet beneath the restored order, subtle changes lingered. Residents had adapted to life without the bells. They had developed observation skills, social coordination, and contingency strategies. Merchants continued to communicate directly about schedules. Apprentices maintained awareness of timing independent of auditory cues, and families relied on natural indicators of time. The silence had instilled habits of attentiveness and patience that persisted long after the mechanical signal returned. The experience also fostered a deeper appreciation for invisible labor. Matthijs's work, once unnoticed, became emblematic of the quiet expertise upon which the town depended. Citizens recognized that every day of smooth operation relied on repetitive, careful, and skilled maintenance. They understood that routine, often overlooked tasks checking the ropes, adjusting the clapper, lubricating the mechanism underpinned the structure of daily life. A single failure could ripple outward, disrupting markets, workshops, schools, and social interaction, demonstrating that civilization depends as much on attention and care as on grand invention or heroic deeds. Interestingly, the silent bells left a cultural imprint. Townspeople shared stories of the weeks when they had lived without auditory guidance, emphasizing the lessons learned through observation, improvisation, and collaboration. Apprentices recounted the challenge of tracking time without cues, learning patience, and the skill of careful attention to detail. Merchants and artisans spoke of the importance of direct communication and contingency planning. The narrative of the bells, silence became part of the town's collective memory, a quiet testament to resilience, adaptability, and human ingenuity. The event also highlighted the subtle ways that minor failures reveal systemic vulnerability. Brackenridge's daily life, like that of many towns, relied on layers of unseen structure, mechanical devices, social coordination, and habitual practice. The bells were visible, but the mechanisms and maintenance were not. Their silence made apparent what had always been true. Stability and continuity are built upon small, repeated acts of labor, patience, and observation. These are the invisible currents that carry daily life, unnoticed until interrupted. In the end, the resumption of sound was both reassuring and instructive. Citizens returned to old routines but with new awareness. They had learned that minor disruptions, seemingly insignificant, could illuminate critical truths about dependence, resilience, and cooperation. Life in Brackenridge became more attentive, deliberate, and resilient, guided not only by bronze bells, but by the shared experience of adaptation and careful observation. And as you imagine standing in the square, hearing the first triumphant chime after weeks of silence, consider this. How much of ordinary life depends on hidden systems, maintained quietly through patient labor and careful observation? How often do small failures teach lessons that outlast the disruption itself? The year the bells went silent reminds us that history is not only shaped by dramatic events or celebrated figures, but by the slow, repetitive, and often unnoticed efforts that sustain daily life, bind communities together, and preserve the rhythm of civilization. Story 8. The Day the Bridges Stayed Empty. In the year 1812, the town of Rivermark, straddling a broad, slow-flowing river, experienced an unusual and subtle disruption. Its bridges, normally bustling with pedestrians, merchants, and carts, stood empty. The bridges had long been central to the town's life, connecting neighborhoods, markets, and workshops. They were not just infrastructure, they were arteries of commerce, social interaction, and community cohesion. When the bridges were suddenly unused for a day, the town discovered how dependent its rhythm had become on these simple structures. The reason for the empty bridges was mundane. An unexpected and unannounced inspection by the town council had closed them for minor maintenance. Planks were checked for rot, ropes and supports inspected, and safety reinforcements added. Citizens, unaware of the closure until arriving at the river's edge, were forced to pause. Merchants could not deliver goods, artisans could not transport materials, and families were prevented from visiting relatives across the water. The bridges' emptiness was a silent disruption, invisible from a distance but deeply felt in the cadence of daily life. At first, people hesitated. Merchants lingered on the near bank, unsure whether waiting would be effective or if they should turn back. Farmers left carts piled with grain, livestock tethered nearby, unable to cross. Students and teachers delayed lessons, couriers postponed deliveries, and workshops operated at half capacity, missing essential supplies. The absence of movement revealed the hidden dependence on these bridges as conduits of activity. Their simple presence had always structured schedules, labor, and interaction, yet no one noticed until they were inaccessible. Some citizens attempted improvisation. Boats and rafts were hastily constructed or borrowed to ferry essential goods across the river, but these were slow, limited, and precarious. Crossing by water required coordination, balance, and patience. Many abandoned the attempt entirely, waiting for the official reopening. Children, who normally played along the bridges, congregated along the banks, inventing games to occupy their attention. These small adjustments, temporary and inefficient, illustrated the town's resilience and resourcefulness, but also its reliance on established infrastructure. The bridges' emptiness subtly affected commerce. Perishable goods delayed in transit began to spoil. Artisans lacked materials for production, slowing workshops. Traders missed appointments with distant townsfolk, and minor economic friction accumulated, unnoticed at first but creating a ripple of inefficiency. Even social interaction suffered. Neighbors could not visit one another, religious observances coordinated across the river were disrupted, and communal gatherings became staggered or canceled. The disruption was quiet, yet it revealed how integrated daily life had become with these ordinary structures. Observers noted that the bridges had done more than simply connect two banks. They structured time and labor. People had organized their day around the predictable availability of passage. Markets opened and closed in coordination with crossings. Workshops scheduled deliveries around transit time. Children's play and family visits were synchronized with the rhythm of the bridge. Their emptiness forced attention to the often overlooked systems that facilitated coordination, cooperation, and community. Even the most mundane aspects of the day were altered. Morning greetings across the bridge were missed, letters and messages were delayed, and casual commerce, small trades, exchange of news, social conversation ceased entirely. People began to notice the invisible scaffolding of daily life, simple bridges that quietly bore the weight of activity, social cohesion, and economic coordination. Without them, life became slower, fragmented, and more deliberate. Interestingly, the empty bridges also fostered observation and reflection. Citizens noticed patterns they had previously ignored: the flow of the river below, the structure of the planks, the alignment of the supports, and the intricate labor required to maintain these crossings. Workshop apprentices watched merchants adjust their plans. Families noted how transport inefficiencies accumulated. Children observed the river's currents and learned to gauge crossing times if necessary. The absence of routine movement transformed a simple pause into an opportunity for learning, reflection, and attentiveness. And so, as you imagine standing at the edge of Rivermark's empty bridges, watching the still waters flow beneath, consider this. How much of daily life depends on ordinary structures, silently supporting schedules, labor, and social cohesion? How often do minor disruptions, closed bridges, paused roads, or unannounced maintenance illuminate the hidden labor, attention, and adaptation that keep communities functioning? The day the bridges stayed empty reminds us that the flow of human life, like the river below, is sustained by quiet, often unnoticed systems. As the day stretched on and the bridges remained closed, the citizens of Rivermark gradually began to navigate their altered reality. What initially had been a temporary inconvenience developed into a lesson in coordination, patience, and observation. Life continued, but every action now required more thought, more communication, and more attention to detail. Merchants were forced to rethink deliveries. Where once a single cart could traverse the bridge in minutes, goods now had to be ferried in smaller batches using rafts or carried by hand along makeshift pathways. Perishable items were particularly affected. Bread, milk, and fresh produce required constant attention to avoid spoilage. Merchants quickly learned to stagger their trips, coordinate with neighbors for shared crossings, and track the flow of supplies in ways that had previously been unnecessary. These improvisations, while laborious, revealed a hidden skill, the ability to plan, communicate, and adapt under constraints, turning disruption into a slow exercise in efficiency. Workshops and artisans experienced similar challenges. Raw materials and components that normally arrived predictably across the bridges now trickled in sporadically. Apprentices and journeymen had to pause, sometimes idle for hours, observing the flow of traffic and adjusting schedules. Supervisors recalibrated projects, breaking tasks into smaller, self-contained units that could progress independently of deliveries. Over time, these adjustments fostered a subtle but meaningful improvement in workflow. Workers became more attentive to timing, sequencing, and the potential for delays, strengthening their skills in patience, observation, and problem-solving. The disruption also affected social interactions. Families could not visit neighbors across the river, communal prayers were delayed, and civic meetings were rescheduled. Residents had to rely on communication through written notes, messengers, or signals from the riverbank. In doing so, they developed new forms of coordination, relying on careful observation and mutual trust rather than default schedules. Children, initially frustrated by the closure, learned to read subtle environmental cues, the direction of boats, the timing of water currents, or the patterns of pedestrian movement along the banks. Ordinary routines became exercises in attentiveness and adaptability. Interestingly, the town also began to notice the hidden labor behind the bridges themselves. Citizens reflected on the meticulous maintenance required to keep the planks, ropes, and supports functional. Craftsmen who inspected and repaired the bridges worked methodically, their efforts invisible during ordinary traffic but critical to daily life. The closure forced Rivermark to confront this invisible work, the patient, repetitive, and precise labor that sustains communal infrastructure. For many, the day revealed a truth often overlooked. Civilization depends as much on quiet maintenance and careful observation as it does on bold deeds or dramatic events. Over the course of the day, improvisation gave rise to innovation. Rafts were reinforced, planks repositioned, and pulley systems devised to transfer goods more safely. Merchants and artisans collaborated, pooling resources and labor to maintain productivity. Families established temporary crossing schedules, sending one representative at a time with messages or supplies. Even the youngest members of the town learned to observe the river, estimating flow speed and timing for safe crossings. Each adaptation, though small, reinforced the town's collective capacity to respond to disruption. Yet the day also underscored vulnerability. Rivermark realized how deeply daily life depended on a handful of key structures. The bridges were not merely convenient, they were central to social, economic, and logistical order. Their closure revealed the fragility of systems taken for granted, emphasizing that small failures in infrastructure could ripple outward, affecting commerce, education, communication, and community cohesion. The town learned that maintaining resilience required both careful observation and deliberate adaptation. By evening, as the bridges remained closed but the citizens had adjusted, a subtle shift occurred. Residents had learned patience, attentiveness, and the value of collaboration. Daily routines, once automatic, now involved active observation and planning. Mistakes had been made: missed deliveries, delayed messages, misaligned schedules, but each misstep offered an opportunity for reflection and improvement. The town, moment by moment, was becoming more resilient and perceptive, quietly strengthened by the constraints imposed by the empty bridges. And so, as you imagine standing along the riverbank, watching the still planks and empty pathways stretching across the water, consider this. How many unnoticed systems shape daily life, quietly guiding routines, labor, and social interaction? How often do minor disruptions reveal the hidden work, attention, and adaptability required to sustain communities? The day the bridges stayed empty demonstrates that resilience often emerges not from grand inventions or heroic acts, but from patience, observation, and the incremental problem-solving of ordinary people navigating ordinary challenges. By the following morning, the bridges of Rivermark reopened. Citizens stepped carefully onto the restored planks, carts rolled across smoothly, and pedestrian traffic resumed its familiar cadence. On the surface, life returned to normal. Merchants delivered goods on time, workshops resumed full production, children crossed to schools and neighbors, and social interactions flowed unhindered. Yet beneath this apparent return to order, subtle changes lingered, quietly shaping the town's awareness and habits. The day of empty bridges had revealed how deeply the town depended on its infrastructure. Merchants now appreciated the precision of timing, planning, and coordination required for trade. Artisans and apprentices had learned to adjust workflows, manage interruptions, and pay closer attention to the arrival of materials. Families recognized the fragility of social connections, realizing that communication, visits, and shared responsibilities relied on more than simple proximity. They required coordination and foresight. Even children, observing the river and its currents, had gained awareness of risk, timing, and observation. Importantly, the experience highlighted the often invisible labor that sustains society. Bridge maintenance, previously unnoticed, became a symbol of patient craftsmanship and careful oversight. Every plank, rope, and support had been inspected, repaired, and aligned with deliberate attention. Citizens recognized that daily life commerce, education, and social interaction depended on this slow, careful work. The bridges, though physical and tangible, represented the broader truth that societal continuity relies on quiet, methodical maintenance, often unappreciated until disruption occurs. The closure also fostered new habits of collaboration. Merchants shared resources to ferry goods across makeshift crossings, families coordinated temporary communication systems, and apprentices observed and assisted with minor adaptations. The collective improvisation strengthened social bonds and cultivated resilience. Even after the bridges reopened, these habits persisted. People became more attentive, more observant, and more willing to plan for contingencies. The town had learned that disruption, even when brief and minor, could serve as a powerful teacher in patience, coordination, and innovation. Economically, the lessons were subtle but lasting. Merchants adjusted stockpiling strategies, anticipating delays and fluctuations in trade. Artisans refined their scheduling, allowing for interruptions in supply chains. Families developed informal contingency plans, ensuring that essential tasks, transport, communication, and work could continue even when infrastructure faltered. The town, in short, had quietly strengthened its capacity to absorb minor shocks, all because a single day had highlighted the fragility and importance of routine crossings. And yet, the day left a lingering reflection. How often do ordinary structures, bridges, roads, clocks, or bells shape the rhythm of life without ever being noticed? How frequently do small, invisible systems support social, economic, and civic activity? And how often are their contributions recognized only in moments of disruption? The empty bridges reminded Rivermark citizens that civilization is maintained not by grand gestures alone, but by patient attention, careful labor, and quiet adaptation to unforeseen challenges. As you imagine walking across the now bustling bridges, consider the invisible lessons carried by every plank and rope. Resilience is learned through observation and adaptation. Social cohesion is reinforced by collaboration, and the rhythm of daily life depends on the patient, often unacknowledged work that sustains infrastructure, trust, and continuity. The day the bridges stayed empty was mundane, even boring in the historical record, yet it quietly reshaped the town's awareness, habits, and resilience in ways that would endure long after the planks were once again filled with movement.